recall I didn't have very many, I did all the heavy rehabilitation in the hospital. We didn't have very many stroke patients, but the few we had were very challenging. Stroke patients were not due to degenerative vascular disease. They were usually due to people who had cardiac disease, such as cardiac valve disease, rheumatic fever, that had valves damaged through rheumatic fever, or had been born with congenital cardiac problems, and clots developed on their valves and then shot off up to the and gave us strokes due to clots being lodged in causing strokes in the brain. In our department we had some parallel bars, and I used to make splints or slings for these patients out of webbing and to support the hemiplegic arm, and the patients would come up to our physio department. They come up in the morning. We had no appointment systems because nobody had any watches and nobody had any calendars, and so the patients would come and spend the day in our physio department and were very, very good at rehabilitation, and I didn't have to drive anybody. We'd show them what exercises to do and then they'd get on doing it, and their one-talks or their family would be there to inspire them. I recall on one of my village patrols, I went to catch up on a gentleman who had had a stroke, and I came into the village with my driver, and it was in the middle of the day, and I had a film crew with me because they were making a film on, it was the Year of the Disabled, and they were wanting to record what happens to a person who's had a stroke and then they go back to the village. We arrived in this village in the middle of the day, and it was absolutely, seemed as though it was empty, because everybody of course is working in the gardens, and my driver called out in the local language, "Is there anybody here? Is there anybody here?" And eventually we found the gentleman we were looking for, and he was in his house in the village. Houses in the village, they were dirt floors, and we went into his house, but his family had made him a bed out of bamboo because it was too hard for him to get down onto the floor to sleep, and they had made him a bamboo sleeping platform. And I thought, oh dear, he's done nothing since since he left hospital, which perhaps was 6 to 8 weeks. But talking to him, he said, "Oh yes, every day I exercise." I was called Sister Belong Exercise, because there was no word in Pidgin for a physiotherapist. And he said, he told me in Pidgin, I won't say it in Pidgin, but he told me, every day I exercise, sister. And so he took me to the area in the village where he exercised, and his family had made this most amazing parallel bars where he walked up and down every day. The parallel bars were just identical to what we had in our department, and they were made out of bamboo. That was very, very uplifting to see how people had taken the ideas and translated into appropriate technology. And I suppose that's perhaps the one thing that's very important when you're working in the third world, is appropriate technology, not to have a lot of technical things. Our Noongar volunteers had always offered to do anything to help us to make physiotherapy more possible, and one of the things they did was get us foam mats so that we didn't have to work on terrazzo floors, which were very hard. Although they were lovely and cool, they were very hard. So we did have mats which we could work with patients and do rehabilitation. Trying to find the appropriate language for rehabilitation was always a challenge. For example, chest physiotherapy. When you tell somebody to take a deep breath, you would say in Pidgin, "Pull and wind strong," which literally translated, it was take a big deep, or pull your wind in strongly or deeply. Chest physiotherapy was not a major part of my work there, because anybody who came in with pneumonia was treated as having TB until proven otherwise. TB and leprosy were two of the commonest diseases that we saw in the wards. But once it was proven that it wasn't TB, then I could do chest physiotherapy. There was quite a lot of chronic lung disease because of smoking. Of course, smoking was endemic there. Many of the tobacco companies offloaded their cigarettes that didn't have any filters or anything like that, so smoking was endemic there, and chronic lung disease associated with that. I saw all sorts of diseases associated with TB. I had never seen Pott's disease. I remember learning about it as a physiotherapy student, but I did have to treat numerous patients with Pott disease. Once they had their TB treatment, then we would mobilise them. They of course come to the hospital and present usually as paraplegics, but was a very good outcome because once they had TB treatment, they had a very good recovery. In fact, many of the conditions I saw were things that I learnt at physiotherapy school but had never seen in New Zealand. Polio still was endemic, and we had an outbreak of polio while I was there. Another interesting disease that I saw was Kuri disease. That's K-U-R-I. Kuri disease is a disease, a neurodegenerative disease that's associated with eating human flesh. And it's virtually died out, but I do remember we had at least one patient who had Kuri disease. He was a Highlander from the Highlands, and cannibalism would have been still a practice when he was a young person. These patients became, it affected all limbs, and they became bedridden, and once they were bedridden, died quite quickly, either from pneumonia or from bed sores and septicemia. If you had a neurodegenerative disease, it was pretty bad because invariably you would die of septicemia from pneumonia or from infected bed sores. We didn't have any fancy equipment. We did have one bed, a mattress that where alternating air pressure, but one for all the patients. Our surgeon, David Hamilton, had been there a very long time and was a very fine surgeon and had to turn his hand to anything. And I do recall sometimes David would be faced with conditions that we had no medicine, and he would say the treatment for this condition is sorry-to-muss. STM, he'd call it, STM treatment, where he would say to them in pidgin, sorry, I've got no medicine or no treatment for this condition, and you must just go back to your village and die. That was part of third world medicine. But one condition that we saw a lot of was cancer of the mouth, and I would always have to do chest physiotherapy for these patients. The patients, what was part of the culture there was eating of betel nut, and they would eat betel nut with lime leaves and dukkha, which was a type of lime that came from ground up coral, but it was very corrosive in the mouth, and cancer of the mouth was had quite a high incidence of cancer of the mouth. If a patient had cancer of the mouth, it was a really horrible disease because basically the patient would die of starvation as the cancer spread. So often presented as cancer just inside the mouth or of the tongue, and David, our surgeon, would do major surgery for this because he felt the condition was, dying of the condition was worse than the surgery, where he would do massive resection of often the lower jaw, the tongue, and then he would do what he'd call a horrendoplasty. He would take a tube of skin from around the neck and attach it to the lower part of the jaw, and then for 3 weeks that would wait till that end healed, and then he would disconnect the tube of skin from the chest and do the full reconstruction and put a graft in or fill in the deficit on the chest wall. So I would do chest physiotherapy with these, and it was quite massive surgery given it's the third world, but the outcome was very good. So there would always be at least one of these patients on the ward. David did all sorts of surgery from children right through to elderly people. He would do all the orthopedic surgery. we would, in those days there was no pins put into fractured femurs. The men were put on, nearly invariably men, they were put on the orthopaedic ward, and there would always be 8 to 10 people on with Thomas splints and traction, waiting for their femurs to heal. And that's actually where I learnt to speak pidgin. I would have a phrase book in my pocket, and I would go into the ward every day to do maintenance exercises with these patients on in the Thomas splints, and that's where I learnt to speak pidgin. All the nurses spoke English and all the doctors spoke English, but none of the patients spoke English. And many of the patients, when particularly older patients, wouldn't even speak pidgin. So I learnt how to a working knowledge of physiotherapy, basic physiotherapy terms in a variety of languages, so that if particularly older patients or people who came from very rural areas, I could say whatever I needed to say in their language. Invariably, if the older people were looked after by their one-talks with their children, they would always speak pidgin, and some of them would speak some English.